Noriko had 7 pots, 9 cents, and 3 days before the pass closed. Every pot was cracked and mended with a seam of gold, and not a man in Slate Creek intended to pay her a fair price for any of them. The town had already decided what a foreign widow was worth. The cold would settle the rest by Friday. Then a rancher who hadn't spoken 10 words all season walked in, picked up the bowl with the longest seam, and asked her what the line meant. Stay until the end to see how a mended bowl and a quiet man turned the worst week of her life into the first week of the rest of it. If it moves, you hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The supply wagon had gone south 3 days before, and the pass above Slate Creek was already turning white at the edges. Noriko sat at the back of Halloran's trading post with her 7 pots laid out on a square of linen, each one wrapped and unwrapped again so the gold seams caught the light from the kerosene lantern above the counter. The lantern threw an amber flickering glow, the only warm color in the room, and it made the seams look like rivers on a map of a country no one in this town had ever heard of. The wood stove in the corner had gone cold an hour ago, because Halloran wouldn't feed it for a woman who wasn't buying. She hadn't bought anything since the wagon dropped her here. She had 9 cents in her pocket and a half sack of rice in the cart outside, and the cold had moved from the wall into her chest sometime during the night and hadn't left. She was small-framed and thin in a way that spoke of months of hunger rather than any natural delicacy, and her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional Japanese knot at the back of her head, the pins plain wood, nothing decorative. Her face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a narrow jaw, and eyes so dark they looked black in the shadow of the doorframe. She wore a dark kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat that someone had given her on the wagon, and the kimono was the only clean thing on her. She hadn't worn Western clothes since she left San Francisco, and wasn't about to start now. The town saw the coat and the foreign face and the pots on the counter, and made its own decision about what she was, and that decision had nothing to do with what she actually had to sell. Halloran ran the only general store between the territorial line and the next county seat, and his counter was the place where a man bought flour, coffee, sugar, hardware, ammunition, and the patent medicines he trusted more than any doctor west of the Platte. Cash was scarce on this frontier, and most ranchers settled their accounts in the fall after the cattle sold, so the counter did double duty as a bank, a post office, and the social heart of a town too small to have any other one. A cattle rustling warrant was pinned to the board behind Halloran's shoulder, the paper curling in the stove heat, and a hand-lettered sign above it said, "All sales final." The sign had been there longer than the warrant. The smell of the place was coffee and kerosene and old leather and the cold that came in under the door and never quite left. Noriko had set the 7 pots out in the order she had mended them, the oldest on the left, the one she had finished on the trail on the right. The longest seam ran through the last bowl, a clean break she had joined with 3 layers of urushi and a line of gold, so fine it looked like a single hair drawn across the ceramic. She had learned the work in Kyoto from her grandmother, who had learned it from her own mother, and the tools she used were in a small lacquered box that sat on the bottom of the cart outside. She hadn't opened the box in front of anyone since she left the coast, and she didn't intend to open it here. The box was the one thing she wouldn't sell, and the town didn't know it existed, and that was the only piece of safety she had left. The cold was the clock. The pass would close by Friday if the snow held, and once it closed, it stayed closed until the spring thaw, and the next supply wagon wouldn't come back until the road was clear. 3 days. She had 3 days to sell enough pottery to buy food, and a corner by a stove, where she would spend the winter in the livery stable where she had been sleeping, and the livery stable would kill her before Christmas. She knew it, and Halloran knew it, and the knowing was the thing he was counting on, Halloran came over at noon with a cup of coffee. He poured for himself and didn't offer her, and he looked at the pots the way a man looks at kindling. He picked up the second bowl, ran his thumb along the gold seam, and set it back down harder than he needed to. "Broken crockery," he said. "Off a China woman." She didn't correct him, had stopped correcting Westerners about the difference between China and Japan somewhere in Nevada, when a railroad foreman had called her a China girl, and she had corrected him twice, and he had still called her a China girl the third time. The word wasn't a mistake, it was a decision the town had already made about her, and no amount of explaining was going to unmake it. She wrapped the bowl back in its linen and put it with the others. "I'll give you a quarter of what you're asking," Halloran said. "Store credit, not silver." She looked at him. He hadn't asked her price, had decided the price was a quarter of what she had named, and had decided the payment would be credit she could only spend in his store, and had decided all of this in the time it took him to pour his own coffee. She said nothing, picked up the linen and folded it square and put it back on the counter, and didn't lower the price, and didn't look away, and after a while Halloran went back to the till and left her alone with the cold. That night, she walked back to the livery stable behind the store and built a small fire in the tin stove the hostler let her use for a dime a night. She opened the lacquered box and laid the tools out on a cloth on the hay. A bamboo spatula, a small jar of dark urushi lacquer, a paper of fine gold powder, a wet stone, and a wooden curing box with a damp cloth inside. She had one bowl left to finish a hairline crack she hadn't had time to mend on the trail, and she worked on it now in the cold and the bad light, because the work was the only thing she had that the town couldn't price. She spread a thin line of lacquer along the crack with the bamboo, waited, layered it again, and dusted the last wet layer with gold. The seam would take weeks to fully cure in a proper humid box, and she didn't have weeks, but the gold would hold the line for the sale, and that was what mattered tonight. She held the bowl the way she always did before she worked on it, both hands palms up, listening with her fingers for where the break had been, and she had learned that from her grandmother. "The bowl will tell you where it hurt," her grandmother had told her, "and you will mend it where it tells you, not where you think it should be." She set the bowl in the curing box, closed the lid, and blew out the lantern. The frost was already on the inside of the stable wall when she lay down. She pulled the trail coat over the kimono and put her hands between her knees for the heat, and slept in the hay with the box of tools beside her, and in the morning the water in the tin cup by the stove had a skin of ice on it. A rancher had been at the feed counter when Halloran gave her his price. She had noticed him the way you notice a man who is standing still in a room where everyone else is moving. He had been buying tack and a sack of flour, and he had paid in silver and counted it out carefully, and hadn't said a word to Halloran beyond the price of the feed. He had watched the whole exchange from across the room, and he had left before she did. And she hadn't thought about him again until the next morning, when she woke to the ice on the cup and the cold in her chest, and the 7 pots still unsold on the cart. The trading post filled by 9 that morning, which was early for Slate Creek in the cold. Halloran had told 2 of the ranch hands about the foreign woman with the broken pots, and they came in to look the way men come in to look at anything new and strange in a town where nothing ever is. The cattle buyer was at the counter settling his account. The preacher from the next county was in for coffee and a new hymnal. 2 trappers stood by the stove, which Halloran had lit because the cattle buyer was a paying customer. Noriko set the pots out on the linen again and waited. The first ranch hand was a man named Reed, who worked a small spread south of town, and he picked up the second bowl and ran his thumb along the gold seam and turned to his friend. "Pretty garbage," he said. His friend laughed. The friend was a bigger man, slow in the face, and he picked up a third bowl and held it up to the lantern and turned it. $1 for the lot, he said, out of Christian charity. She didn't flinch or lower the price. She took the bowl out of his hand the way you take a child out of the hands of someone who doesn't know how to hold one, and she set it back on the linen and wrapped it. The cattle buyer watched from the counter and said nothing. The preacher turned his back and asked Halloran for the hymnal, and the trappers by the stove looked at their boots. Then Pollard came out from behind the dry goods counter, and the room shifted. Pollard was Halloran's cousin, and he ran the dry goods side of the store, and he had the soft hands and the soft voice of a man who had never done a day of work that couldn't be undone by a hot meal. He came and stood over the pots and looked down at her and smiled the way a man smiles when he's about to do you a favor you didn't ask for. $2 for all 7, he said, and a sack of flour. Take it or leave it. She looked at him. The price she had named was $4 a bowl, 28 for the lot, and he was offering her $2 and a sack of flour and the smile. I'm doing you a kindness, he said. Your kind don't last a winter out here without someone taking you in. The threat wasn't in the price was an insult, but insult she could survive. The threat was in the last 6 words, in the way he said them, and in the way he looked at her when he said them, and in the way Halloran didn't look up from the till. She understood the way she had understood the railroad foreman in Nevada, that the words weren't a mistake. They were a decision the town had already made about her body, and the price was just the receipt. Her stomach turned. She hadn't eaten since the day before, and the half sack of rice in the cart wasn't going to last the week, and the cold was in her chest, and the pass was going to close in 2 days now, and she was way from giving up everything her grandmother had taught her about what a mend was worth. Her hand moved toward the bowl, and she felt her own fingers on the linen. Then she stopped, and she didn't know, that moment, what stopped her. Later, she would think it was her grandmother's voice in her head saying, "The bowl will tell you where it hurt," and she would think it was the years of holding broken things and listening to them. And she would think it was simply that she had been broken herself once, and had mended herself with gold. And she wasn't going to let a man named Pollard buy the mend for $2 and a sack of flour. She wrapped the pot and put it back on the linen and said nothing. Pollard looked at her for a long moment, and then he shrugged and walked back behind his counter. The ranch hands left, preacher left, the cattle buyer settled up and left. The room thinned to Halloran at the till, and the trappers by the stove, and the silent rancher at the feed counter, the one she had noticed the day before, the one who had watched Halloran give her his price and had left without a word. She went out the back door into the alley to eat, took a handful of raw rice from the half sack in the cart, and chewed it dry, because she had no fire to cook it over, and no one in this town to ask for one. She ate it slowly, the way a woman eats when she has learned that food isn't always coming. The rice was hard, and it hurt her teeth, and it did nothing for the cold in her chest. The rancher was at the back of the alley, loading the tack and the flour into his buckboard. He wasn't looking at her, and then he was. She didn't see the moment his face changed, only saw that it had changed. The way a man's face changes when he has seen something he didn't expect to see and can't stop seeing. She didn't know what to do with that look, so she did what she always did, which was nothing. And she finished the rice, wiped her hands on the trail coat, and walked back inside. He followed her in, but didn't come to the pottery table. He went back to the feed counter and stood there with his back to her, and didn't say a word to anyone. And the morning passed, and the room thinned, and the gold seams caught the lantern light, and nobody bought a thing. By the middle of the afternoon, the trading post had emptied out. Pollard had given up for the day and gone to the back room to do inventory. Halloran was counting the till, humming a hymn under his breath, badly. The trappers had drifted out to the saloon. Noriko was at the counter repacking the cart for the morning because she had decided she would try the pass at first light even if it was already closing. Because staying in Slate Creek was no longer a question of whether she would sell a pot. It was a question of whether she would survive the man who wanted to buy her for $2 and a sack of flour. She wrapped the last bowl, the one with the longest seam, the one she had finished in the livery stable the night before, set it on top of the linen in the cart, and was reaching for the next one when a hand came into her view and picked up the bowl she had just set down. She didn't look up at first, just looked at the hand. It was a working hand, calloused across the palm and across the base of the fingers. The kind of hand that came from years of fence wire and rope and tack and the cold metal of a bridle bit at 4 in the morning. The kind of hand she had seen on the ranchers all week without once seeing one of them touch one of her pots. He turned the bowl in his hands the way she turned a bowl before she mended it, slowly, with the fingertips, following the seam. She looked up. It was the rancher from the feed counter, the one who had watched her eat the raw rice in the alley, the one whose face had changed. Up close, he was older than she had thought, somewhere past 40, with the deep lines that the sun and the wind put on a man who had been alone, outside for a long time. He didn't look at her, just at the seam. "What's the line?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was a flat frontier statement that wanted an answer, the kind of sentence a man says when he doesn't know how to ask a question and doesn't want to learn. She looked at the bowl in his hands, and she answered him the way her grandmother would have answered in 3 short sentences, and she didn't say the word kintsugi because the word wasn't the point. "The bowl was broken," she said. "I mended it with lacquer and gold. The mend is part of the bowl now. It isn't a thing to hide." He turned the bowl again. He traced the seam with his thumb, and she watched his thumb and not his face. "Where'd you learn it?" he said. "Kyoto," she said. "My grandmother, before I was born." He nodded, the way a man nods when he has been given a piece of information he's going to keep. "How long?" he said. "For one bowl. Weeks," she said. "Sometimes months." Depending on the break, he set the bowl down on the counter between them, the seam facing up, and he looked at her for the first time. He had the eyes of a man who hadn't slept a full night in years, and he looked at her the way she looked at a bowl before she mended it, and she didn't know what to do with that either. "Have you ever mended a thing that wasn't pottery?" he said. She didn't answer. Something passed between them in the silence, and it wasn't love and it wasn't trust, it was a recognition, the kind that happens once or twice in a life between 2 people who have both been broken and have both put themselves back together with something that shows. She didn't know his break, he didn't know hers. They knew the seams. His gaze went past her to the cart behind her, to the lacquered box on the bottom of it, the one she hadn't opened in front of anyone since the coast. She put her hand on the box without thinking, the way a woman puts her hand on a door she doesn't want opened. He saw the hand but didn't ask about the box, and looked back at the bowl. He looked at the bowl again and asked the price. $4, she said for the bowl. It was the full price. Not the quarter Halloran had offered, not the $2 Pollard had thrown at her for the whole lot. $4 for one bowl, 28 for 7, and she didn't negotiate, and she didn't look away. He didn't flinch at the number. He reached into his coat. He set the silver on the counter 1 piece at a time, and he counted it out where Halloran could hear it. $4 for the first bowl, 4 for the second, 4 for the third. He didn't ask for a discount on the lot, didn't ask for store credit, didn't haggle. And he laid the silver down in a line, and the line got longer, and Halloran's hand stopped on the till, and the hymn he had been humming stopped in his throat. By the 5th bowl, Pollard had come out from the back room, and was standing at the edge of the dry goods counter with a bolt of cloth in his arms he had forgotten he was holding. The ranch hands from that morning had come back in for no reason, and they were standing by the door. The trappers had come back from the saloon. The whole room was watching the silver and the man counting it out, and the room was quiet in the way a room is quiet when something has happened that nobody expected and nobody knows how to undo. $28. He set the last coin on the counter, and the line of silver was the length of a forearm, and Noriko hadn't moved. He had bought every piece she had at the price she had named, in front of the people who had spent 2 days telling her the pieces were worth almost nothing. He had paid in silver, which on this frontier was the same as paying in respect. Pollard set the bolt of cloth down on the counter and walked over. The soft voice came back, and the smile came back with it. "She's got no papers," Pollard said. "No claim to the pottery. No business trading in Slate Creek at all, far as I know. Could settle it with the sheriff if you want. He drinks at the back table most afternoons." The threat was out in the open now. No more subtext, no more kindness, no more smile, hiding the thing underneath. Pollard was going to void the sale, and he was going to call the sheriff, and the sheriff was going to come out from the back table, and Noriko was going to be run out of town with no money and a closed pass, or worse than run out. The floor dropped out from under the room. The ranch hands by the door didn't move. Halloran didn't look up from the till. Noriko stood at the counter with her hands at her sides and didn't reach for the silver because she understood that the silver wasn't hers yet, that it had never been hers yet, that in this town a foreign woman's sale was a sale only until a white man decided it wasn't. Maverick didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at her. He looked at Pollard, and he said one sentence, and the sentence wasn't true yet, and he said it anyway. "That's my wife's work," he said. The room reorganized itself around the sentence. Pollard stopped. Halloran stopped. The ranch hands looked at their boots. The sheriff didn't come out from the back table. The trappers drifted toward the door, and the hymn didn't start again. Maverick didn't ask her permission, didn't explain, didn't look at her to see if the lie was all right. He turned back to the counter, and he picked up the wrapped pots, all 7 of them, and he set them back in her cart, as if the cart and the pots and the woman pulling it now belonged to the same story. He looked at Halloran. "Get her a sack of flour and a pound of coffee," he said, "against what she's owed." Halloran did it. He wrote it in the ledger, and he put the flour and the coffee on the counter, and he didn't say a word. The town watched him do it. Maverick picked up the cart shafts himself. He didn't ask her if she wanted him to. He walked the cart out the front door of the trading post and set it by the buckboard, and came back in and looked at her. "You got away home," he said. It wasn't a question either. It was the same flat frontier statement that wanted an answer. "No," she said. "I got a buckboard outside," he said. He went back out. She stood in the trading post with the silver still on the counter, and the flour and the coffee still on the counter, and the 7 pots in the cart by the buckboard, and the sentence he had spoken still hanging in the air. She picked up the silver and put it in the pocket of the trail coat against her hip, where she could feel the weight of it, then picked up the flour and the coffee and walked out of Halloran's trading post with her cart and her tools and her grandmother's lacquered box. And she didn't look back at Pollard, and she didn't look back at Halloran. And the sheriff didn't come out from the back table. Maverick was loading the pots into the buckboard when she came out. He had set each one on a folded horse blanket on the bed of the wagon so they wouldn't knock against each other on the road, and she hadn't asked him to do that. She watched him do it, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and the snow started to fall about. Then the first real snow of the season, and it fell on the gold seams of the last bull he had set in the wagon, and it didn't melt. She didn't know yet what was waiting at the end of the road south, and he hadn't told her, and the snow was already closing the pass behind them. The road south out of Slate Creek ran along the creek for the first mile, and then climbed a low ridge and dropped into a valley where the wind was less and the snow collected in the draws and stayed. Maverick drove. Noriko sat beside him with the last bowl in her lap wrapped in its linen. The buckboard hauled the pots and the flour and the coffee, and the two of them without complaint. The horses knew the road. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. The creek was black, with early ice at the edges, and the sky was the color of wet stone, and the snow came down steady and quiet and collected on the brim of his hat and on the linen in her lap, and didn't melt. She held the bowl the way she always held a bowl before she mended it, both hands, palms up, and there was nothing to mend in it. But the holding was the only thing she knew how to do with her hands when she was afraid, and she was afraid, and she didn't pretend she wasn't. He broke the silence once, about halfway, to point at a ridge on the right, where the scrub oak gave way to a line of cottonwoods along a creek bed. "That's the north section," he said. 2 sentences about the land in the whole drive. No more. He didn't narrate his life or ask about hers. He didn't say the word wife again, and she didn't say it either. And the sentence he had spoken in the trading post sat between them on the seat like the bowl, and neither of them picked it up. The ranch was smaller than she had expected. A low house of dovetailed logs, with a plank roof, a barn, a corral with 3 horses, a haystack, a root cellar dug into the hill behind the house. It was the house of a man who lived alone and had lived alone for a long time, and the loneliness was in the details and not in anything he said. 1 plate by the sink, 1 chair at the table, 1 hook by the door with 1 coat on it. The stove was lit when they came in, which meant someone had been tending it, which meant he had left it banked that morning, expecting to come back to it. And the warmth of it hit her face the way warmth hits a person who has been cold for a long time, and she didn't let it show on her face. He took her coat and hung it on a second hook by the door, a hook she hadn't noticed until he used it, and she understood that the hook had been empty for a long time, and that he had put it there for a coat that wasn't his. He showed her the room at the back of the house without ceremony. He opened the door and stepped aside and let her go in first. The room had a window that faced east, a small stove, and a low table, and on the table was a kiln. It wasn't a frontier kiln, not a wood-fired thing of brick and mud. It was a small Japanese-style kiln, clearly shipped in at cost, clearly waiting for someone who knew how to use it. The room had been built for a woman who worked with clay, and the kiln had been sitting on the table for a long time, and the table was dusty around it, but the top of the kiln was clean. She stood in the doorway and looked at the kiln for a long time. Then she turned to him. "Who is the room for?" she said. It was the first question she had asked him in the whole story. "My wife," he said. "She's dead." He didn't say any more, didn't say how or when or what she had died of, or whether she had ever used the kiln. He stood in the doorway of the back room, and he looked at the kiln, and then he looked at her, and the look was the same look he had given her in the trading post when he turned the bowl, the look of a man who sees the seam in a thing and doesn't look away from it. "You can use it or not," he said. "Stay or go. The pass opens in the spring if you want to leave." He set the 7 pots on the shelf, in the kitchen, not in the room, because the room was for new work, not for the mended past, and he had understood that without being told, the way he had understood to put the pots on the horse blanket in the buckboard without being asked. The understanding was the thing she didn't know what to do with, so she did what she always did, which was nothing. She stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at the kiln and the east window and the shelf where new pots would go, and she understood that he had bought the 7 pots not because he wanted them, but because he couldn't stand to watch the town take them from her for nothing, and that understanding didn't diminish the act. It deepened it. He hadn't rescued her, had paid her what she was worth in front of the people who refused to, and then had given her a room to work in, and had refused to make it a debt. He was standing in the doorway. He looked at her, and he said one more sentence, and it wasn't a question. "You don't have to stay," he said. She looked at the kiln. She looked at the east window, then the shelf. "I know," she said. He nodded. He left her to the room. She heard him walk back to the kitchen and put more wood on the stove, and she heard the kettle go on, and she stood in the back room in the dark and put her hand on the kiln and felt the cold clay of it under her palm, and the asking had already happened, and her answer was the work she was about to begin. The weeks passed away. Weeks pass on a frontier ranch in the winter, which is to say they passed slowly, and they passed in work. She cooked the meals, not because he asked her to, but because the kitchen was there and she was there and someone had to. He chopped the wood and fed the stock and mended the fences and came in at night with ice in his beard and sat at the table and ate what she had made and didn't say much. They learned each other in small frontier sentences, never long. He told her the north section lost 3 panels of fence in the storm that came in 2 days after the pass closed. She told him the rice was running low, and she would need flour and salt at the next chance. They didn't talk about the trading post or about the sentence he had spoken there. The sentence sat on the shelf in the kitchen with the 7 pots and didn't need to be picked up. She started new work in the back room the second week, the first new pot in years that wasn't a mend, and she wedged the clay on the low table in front of the east window in the morning light and held the form the way she always held the form, both hands, palms up, listening with her fingers for where the piece wanted to break. There was no break to find. The clay was new. She didn't know what to do with a thing that hadn't been broken yet, so she made a small bowl plain and set it on the shelf to dry, and looked at it for a long time, and didn't put any gold on it. He came in one evening in the 3rd week with a deep, clean cut across the inside of his left hand, the kind of cut a fence nail puts in a man when the wood is cold, and the nail is barbed, and the hand is tired. He had wrapped it in a rag, and the rag was soaked through, and he sat down at the table and put the hand on the wood and didn't say anything, and he was going to leave it at that, the way a man who has been alone a long time leaves things at that. She didn't say a word, got up from the table and got the clean cloth and the kettle and the small tin of salve she carried in the lacquered box, the one she hadn't opened in front of anyone since the livery stable. She sat down across from him and took his hand the way she took a bowl, before she mended it, both her hands, palms up, and turned it, cleaned the cut with the hot water and the clean cloth, put the salve along the line of it, and racked it, and didn't let go of it for a long moment after she had finished. He hadn't expected that, and she could feel it in the hand, the way the tension went out of it, the way tension goes out of a bowl. When it has decided to let you mend it, she let go, put the tin of salve back in the box, and closed the lid. He looked at his wrapped hand on the table, and he looked at her, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't say anything, and the kettle started to sing on the stove, and neither of them moved to take it off. She finished the first new bowl at the end of the 4th week and set it on the kitchen table next to his plate the next morning. Plain and mended, no gold, the clay a clean red-brown from the bank behind the barn. She set the last of the mended pots beside it, the one with the longest seam, the one he had turned in his hands at the trading post, the one that had started all of this 2 vessels, on the kitchen table, one mended, one new. The gold seam of the mended one caught the kerosene light the same way it had caught the lantern light on Halloran's counter, only now it sat on a table where 2 people ate every night. He came in from the chores and saw the 2 bowls, and he didn't say anything, just set his hat on the hook by the door and came to the table. He put his hand over hers on the wood, palm down, the same hand she had mended the week before. She didn't pull away, didn't cry. She turned her hand under his, so their palms met the way she turned a bowl before she mended it, and she let it stay. The pass would open in the spring. She would decide then whether to load the cart or leave it in the barn. The story doesn't say which she chose. The two bowls sat on the table in the kerosene light, one mended and one new, and the story doesn't say which one was more beautiful. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels.